Hello everyone, Helen here, back in the campervan again. I'm going to bring you the second part of Phil and I's most recent campervan trip to Dumfries and Galloway in the south-western corner of Scotland. Nearly forgot where it was there. Thank you everybody for watching and enjoying, and some of you commenting on the first part of this trip. And I'm going to get straight on with the second part. So I left you last time when we just visited the southerly point, the most southerly point of the Rins of Galloway, and we were heading north. We were on our way to just north of Stranraer to visit an uncle and cousin who I hadn't seen for several years. We received a warm welcome, and it was so lovely to see them again. We met my Uncle Alan's little dachshund, who's called Holly, and a very old black cat called Pops, and I enjoyed seeing some of the interesting family memories that my uncle has in an ancient bothy in his back garden, including some war medals that were awarded to one of my great uncles, Jack Kettridge, and a painting done by my grandpa Kettridge. My uncle is a keen gardener, and we enjoyed a blustery stroll around his lovely garden. Leaving there at the end of the afternoon, we set off in search of an overnight spot that would be reasonably sheltered from the wind and not next to any tall trees. And we found a little car park below a monument that was just perfect, and we just had it to ourselves for the night. The Agnew monument was built in 1850 in memory of Sir Andrew Agnew of Lochnaw Castle, and he was a Scottish politician, an MP for Wigtonshire, and he was described as a kind and genial man who tried to get a bill through Parliament to stop all secular work on Sundays, a bill that was fervently opposed by the author Charles Dickens. The monument is at the centre of what was once an Iron Age hill fort, which had two massive ramparts going around the hill, known as the Tor of Craiggoch. We thought about walking up to the monument and taking a look at the remains of the hill fort after breakfast, but changed our minds when we saw how muddy it was on the other side of the gate to get up the hill. So instead, we set off to visit another lighthouse. As we pulled into the car park, we heard a crunch, and Phil quickly discovered that our drinking water was gushing out onto the ground. The water tap valve had snapped off. He plugged the hole with his thumb while I fetched the broken valve, and he did manage to wedge it back on again. It was in a glorious spot in the sunshine, overlooking the coastline and still very windy. We walked along to take a look at the Killantringan Lighthouse, which is no longer in operation, and in fact it now serves as holiday accommodation. What a wonderful place to spend some time with all those views across to the sea, especially when the sea's quite rough and interesting. I could stand and watch it for hours. This particular lighthouse, which is yet another built by the famous Stevenson family, was one of the later houses, and it became operational in the year 1900, a waypoint of light on the channel in the Irish Sea. Phil decided he wanted to go for a walk along the coastline, but I'd had enough of being blustered by the wind, so I waved him off, and he made his way across some fairly boggy ground along what is part of a long-distance footpath called the Southern Uplands Way. He wanted to go and see 2 cable huts, little octagonal buildings that were part of the first telephone link between Scotland and Ireland, where cables were laid under the sea, first for telegraph messages in 1852 and later for telephone. The site was in use for about 100 years, and the huts housed testing equipment to make sure the cables remained in working order. Meanwhile, I walked back to the van for a bit of cosy crafting time. I'd brought a few projects with me in my usual Harris tweed bag, which I call the craft bag in the campervan, which you can see here. And I had some appropriate project bags too. There was Florence the donkey's little backpack that I was busy knitting. I just had the straps to finish off at that point. Then, in a bag made for me by my lovely Instagram friend Leslie, was the beginnings of Bernard, the tutu bear, who's now known as the Icelandic Lopi bear, as I was using Icelandic Let Lopi yarn. I had my new hussif, or sewing kit, with me, and a pile of ready-cut shapes for making quilt-as-you-go 2.5-inch squares. And finally, I had a sock to work on too, using the West Yorkshire Spinners owl colourway. So I had plenty to keep me busy, but I decided that I was in the mood for sewing. Soon Phil was heading back towards the van, taking more photos of the lighthouse as he got closer to it. You can also see its foghorn here, which was no longer used after 1987, and the lighthouse itself was decommissioned in 2005. I love this distant view of where we'd parked the van and where I was happily sewing. Phil got back to the van in a slightly muddy state, although the wind had soon dried the mud on his trousers. We were then on the move again, hoping that the water valve would stay put, otherwise we would have been out without drinking water. It did indeed stay on, and later we were able to secure it with gaffer tape and also buy some big bottles of drinking water just to be on the safe side. Phil kept an even more careful lookout for potholes as we drove a few miles to the seaside village of Port Patrick. It was lovely to see the little lambs running about in the fields. The wind kept up its gusting all the way, but everywhere looked just so beautiful. Soon we arrived in Port Patrick, a village founded, you won't be surprised to know, on the fishing industry. From the 17th century, it was the main port for goods and mail traffic between Scotland and Ireland, although it didn't remain this for very long, because the prevailing strong winds up the channel were just impractical, and Stranraer, which is more sheltered, took over as the main port. And this was even despite the engineer John Smeaton building a proper harbour for Port Patrick in 1770, and a later harbour was built in 1821. The weather when we were there gave a good demonstration of the strength of the sea. Even the inner harbour had quite a swell on the water. After a very nice lunch in a cafe called the Port Pantry, Phil had a chicken burger and a huge stack of onion rings on top of it, and I had a favourite meal of mine, scampi and chips, which was delicious. We had a little walk around the harbour and took a look at the lifeboat, as well as supporting the RNLI shop, which is an excellent charity that supports the lifeboat operations. And we stood for a while watching some impressive waves crashing up onto the shore. It's a pity it was so windy and that I can't give you the sound of the waves, because I haven't got any protection for my camera's microphone and the wind noise is just too unpleasant. There was then time to set off again, to travel up towards the north coast. The sun kept shining and the wind finally began to lose its strength. We stopped briefly to see another lighthouse, Corswell Lighthouse, built in 1817, so quite an early one. Apparently, soon after it was commissioned, the principal keeper at Corswell fell asleep while on duty, and the revolving apparatus of the light stopped for a while. The keeper was suspended from his post, and instead he was sent to the Bellrock Lighthouse to act as an assistant. Another interesting fact about this lighthouse is that in November 1970, when Concorde flew over the lighthouse on a trial flight, quite a few panes of glass were broken. The lighthouse accommodation buildings now operate as the Corswell Lighthouse Hotel. We drove around to the east coast, looking over to Loch Ryan. On the other side of the loch is the ferry terminal of Cairn Ryan, now the place where ferries set off for Northern Ireland, and we drove down a very bumpy road to a secluded spot called Lady Bay. We visited it partly because we used to live in a bit of Nottingham called Lady Bay, but mainly because my uncle recommended it. And it certainly was rather a lovely spot, though it's not one that allows overnight stays. After calling in to see my uncle and cousin again, we paused briefly at an old airbase that had been in use since the 1920s by the RAF flying boats. In the Second World War, it was one of the largest flying boat bases in Britain, and as well as British planes, such as the Sunderland boat planes, they had American Catalinas there. The base was positioned here on the shores of Loch Ryan, which is a sheltered and fairly remote location, with easy access from the runway to the sea. As the afternoon came to its end, it was time to start making our way to an overnight spot. We'd decided to go to another place where we'd stayed before, but firstly we made a slight detour to a little village by the sea, where Phil had found out there was a place for filling up with drinking water. After losing some of our water the previous day, we thought it would be advisable to top up. Once done, we set off again, drove through the town of Newton Stewart, and onwards along an exceedingly lumpy-bumpy road by the side of the River Cree to a little RSPB car park in the Wood of Cree. I love the name of this wood because it sounds a bit like something out of a Tolkien story. Once again, we had the place to ourselves, and after some cream cheese and crisp sandwiches and a bit of salad, we settled down for the night, hoping that in the morning we would be treated to a dawn chorus as we had the last time we were there. We weren't disappointed. I woke early and stepped outside the van to make another recording of the beautiful birdsong. After that wonderful start to the day, we took our time to just enjoy being in the woods. Phil went off on a little walk up the hill through the woods, and I had a lovely time just taking photos. By late morning it had begun to rain, and it was destined to stay with us for the rest of the day and into the following day. We thought it was perfect weather for a second visit to Wigton, a place that specialises in second-hand bookshops. We had time for a little shopping before lunch. In fact, we first of all went into a lovely antique shop with the Gaelic name Fedale, which means lucky find. They had some beautiful things in there. And I came away with a couple of items, a gorgeous little china bowl and a larger Ainsley china dish with lots of small illustrations on it that I absolutely loved. And it's already been used when we had some visitors at home for cake and scones. We had lunch in a book cafe called Reading Lasses, where we'd been once before, a bookshop that's owned and run by women, hence its name. And the cafe tables and chairs are just set amongst the bookshelves. As we often do, we had soup, and mine came with 2 delicious homemade sausage rolls, and Phil had sandwiches with his. Later we returned there for tea and cake, and I loved my slice of chocolate caramel cake. Thanks again to Ko-fi supporters for treating us. In between lunch and tea, we had a wonderful time browsing in 2 or 3 of the bookshops. The rain became heavier and heavier as we left Wigton and travelled further south. The little peninsula we were on is known as the Machars, which means coastal pastures. We soon arrived in Whithorn and paused to visit Whithorn Priory, which was one of Scotland's first Christian communities from the 8th century. Built there because it's where the shrine of St. Ninian was, and it was also visited by Robert the Bruce when he was close to death in the early 14th century. Not much is known about St. Ninian, although he is described in the 8th century writings of the Venerable Bede as a most reverend bishop and holy man of the nation of the Britons. And some say he brought Christianity to Scotland before St. Columba. We didn't stay for long because we were getting soaked by the rain. We drove onwards towards the Isle of Whithorn, down on the south coast of the Machars. It actually was an island until at least the early 19th century, but it isn't any longer. We spent even less time there. We just had no great desire to get wet, and we decided it was time to find somewhere to stop for the night. We were happy to find another forest car park at Kilsture Wood, and we were there by ourselves throughout the rainy night, although I did spot 3 roe deer making their way through the trees at one point. We set off on our final morning and drove eastwards, stopping when we arrived in the small town of Gatehouse of Fleet. This place was a planned town, built on the instructions of a local landowner and businessman, James Murray, in the 1770s to 1790s. The town was centred around a couple of cotton mills, but it turned out they just couldn't compete with the larger mill towns and cities, even when they changed to producing bobbins, and the town stopped growing after the 1850s. We visited the mill on the Fleet, one of the old mills that's been renovated and turned into a community space for exhibitions and other things. We loved the model of the town as it is now, and it shows that the layout hasn't really changed since it was first built. And there are many houses and buildings that have got preservation orders on them. You can see that each house was given a very generous garden space. Surprisingly, the mills didn't rely on the river for their power, but on a mill pond that supplied water along a channel to the water wheels on the mills. On the top floor of the mill is a very large second-hand bookshop. Of course, we never tire of looking through more old books, and it's here that I found a book that I've already shown you, the Fireside Lesson Book. On the same floor, there's also a shop selling local crafts of all kinds, including pottery, some glasswork, and some beautiful crocheted hats. I liked some of the wall art as well, produced by the local spinning and weaving group, such as this large representation of a mill wheel depicting the natural environment, and a very realistic woven picture of books on a bookshelf, and some scenes from books written by Scottish authors. I wonder if you can name the 4 that I photographed. We stopped by the gatehouse from which the town gets its name, Gatehouse of Fleet. It's a fairly unprepossessing building, but it was built by the local lairds, the Murrays, to collect tolls from everyone who came through the town. The road that went through the town was on the main route to the ferry to and from Ireland. After a fairly average lunch in the Masonic Arms, we were then ready to head for home. And we really had a lovely few days, quite a mixture of weathers, but we just found activities that were appropriate to the weather, and there's always things to do. And if nothing else, we just stay nice and cosy in the van and have things to do with us here as well. So thanks to everybody who has already made lovely comments on the previous trip, and I hope you've enjoyed seeing the second half of it. And there'll definitely be more campervan trips coming very soon, so keep an eye out for those. But until I see you again, keep nice and busy, not too busy, and take great care of yourself. I will see you again very soon. Okay then, bye.